Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we continue following James and Diep after a painful confrontation with James's parents forces him to make a difficult choice. Torn between family duty and the quiet life he built with Diep and little Nhi, James decides to return to his parents' home, knowing that leaving doesn't mean giving up, but also understanding that distance can test even the strongest love. As night falls and morning comes too soon, promises are made, tears are held back, and a temporary separation begins. Stay with us until the end to see how this distance reshapes James's resolve, strengthens Diep's quiet courage. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The news didn't come gently. It arrived like a sudden storm, loud and unforgiving. James had just finished stacking the last wooden crate near the small house when the sound of a car engine broke the quiet of the countryside. The gravel crunched sharply, tires stopping right in front of the yard. He froze, his hands still resting on the crate, a strange heaviness pressing into his chest before he even turned around. He knew. When he looked up, his parents were already stepping out of the car. His father's face was rigid, jaw tight, eyes burning with restrained anger. His mother followed, her steps hurried, her expression a mix of fury, fear, and exhaustion. The moment her eyes landed on James, her composure cracked. "James!" she called out, her voice shaking. "So this is where you've been hiding." Diep stood just inside the doorway, instinctively pulling Nhi closer to her. The child sensed the tension immediately, her earlier laughter fading as she clutched her mother's sleeve and peeked out with wide, uncertain eyes. James took a slow breath and walked forward. "Mom. Dad." His father didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, he scanned the small yard, the modest house, the stacked crates, the faint smell of smoke from the kitchen. Disdain flickered across his face. "So this is the life you chose," his father said coldly. "Living like this? With her?" The word "her" landed like an accusation. Diep stiffened, but she didn't step back. James stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. "If you're here to yell, then yell at me. Leave them out of it." That only fueled the fire. His mother rushed closer, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through?" she cried. "We searched everywhere for you. I was hospitalized because of stress. Do you know that?" James's throat tightened. "I didn't ask you to. You disappeared," she cut in. "No calls, no explanations. And then we find out you're living with a woman and her child. Like this is nothing." Diep finally spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Auntie, uncle, please, this isn't what you think." His father turned sharply. "You stay out of this." The yard fell silent, the air thick and heavy. James clenched his fists. "Don't talk to her like that." His father's eyes narrowed. "So you've really chosen her over your own family?" "That's not true," James said firmly. "I chose my life." His mother broke down completely then, tears spilling freely. "Your life?" she sobbed. "What about your responsibility? The company? Your brother hung? Do you think we raised you just so you could run away and live in a place like this?" James felt the familiar pressure building in his chest. the same pressure that had followed him his entire life. "I didn't run away," he said quietly. "I left because I couldn't breathe anymore." His father laughed bitterly. "You couldn't breathe. We gave you everything: education, money, opportunities people dream of. And control," James shot back. "You controlled every decision, every relationship, even who I was allowed to love." His mother shook her head violently. "We only wanted what was best for you." "No," James replied. "You wanted what you decided was best." Silence crashed down between them. Nhi tugged gently at Diep's hand and whispered, "Mom, are they angry because of me?" Diep's heart clenched. She crouched down and hugged her tightly. "No, sweetheart, this isn't your fault." James heard it, and it cut deeper than any accusation. His mother noticed the child then, really noticed her, and her tears faltered. "Is that her daughter?" James nodded. "Yes, her name is Nhi." His father scoffed. "And you're playing father now?" James didn't hesitate. "I care about her." That was the final straw. His father stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "Enough. You're coming home. Today." James met his gaze without backing down. "No." "What did you say?" his father demanded. "I said no," James repeated. "I'm not going back like this." His mother grabbed his sleeve again, desperation flooding her face. "James, please. People are talking. They're saying terrible things. About you. About us. Do you want your parents to live in shame?" James closed his eyes for a brief moment. "There it is," he murmured. "Reputation. Always reputation." She cried harder. "If you loved me, you wouldn't let me suffer like this." Those words hit him hardest. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of workers' voices from the orchard. Life went on. Indifferent to the storm in the yard, James opened his eyes again, pain and resolve battling inside him. "I love you," he said slowly, "but love shouldn't feel like a cage." His father snapped, "Enough philosophy. Pack your things." James shook his head. "I won't abandon Diep and Nhi." Diep stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm. "Uncle, Auntie, James didn't force himself into our lives. He helps us. He respects us. If you're angry, please be angry at me too." His mother stared at her, disbelief and anger mixing together. "Do you think love is enough to survive? Do you know how different his world is from yours?" Diep met her gaze without flinching. "I know it's different, but he's happy here." James felt his heart tighten. His father let out a long, sharp breath. "Happiness doesn't pay debts. It doesn't run companies." "I never asked to inherit the company," James replied. "You forced that future on me." Another heavy silence. Finally, his mother collapsed onto a wooden bench, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't lose you," she cried. "I already lost my health worrying about you. If you don't come back, I don't know if I can survive it." James felt something inside him crack. He knelt in front of her, taking her shaking hands. "Mom." She looked at him through tears. "Come home. Just come home. At least live separately. Don't stay here. Please." His father added coldly, "If you don't return, don't expect peace. I won't allow this relationship to continue." Diep's face went pale. James stood up slowly. He looked at Diep, at Nhi, at the small house that had given him peace for the first time in years. Then he looked back at his mother. "I'll go back," he said finally. The words tasted bitter. His mother gasped, then burst into tears again, this time of relief. She stood and hugged him tightly, clinging to him as if afraid he would disappear again. "Thank you," she whispered over and over. His father exhaled, tension easing slightly from his shoulders. "You made the right choice." James didn't respond. He turned toward Diep. Their eyes met, unspoken words flowing between them. Fear, pain, understanding, and something stronger underneath. "I'll explain everything tonight," he said softly. Diep nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'll wait." As the car pulled away later, rain began to fall lightly, blurring the yard, the house, and the life James had chosen. He stood there in the drizzle, feeling both heavier and emptier than ever before, knowing this was only the beginning of a much deeper conflict, one that would test not just his love, but his courage to fight for it. Night fell slowly, but the heaviness inside the small house settled almost immediately. The rain had stopped, yet the cold seemed to seep into everything. The wooden floor, the thin walls, even the space between breaths. James sat near the fire, staring at the glowing embers as they cracked softly. Each spark felt like a second slipping away, counting down to a morning he didn't want to face. Diep moved quietly in the kitchen, reheating the food he had prepared earlier that day. The smell of warm rice and soup filled the air, but neither of them felt hungry. Every movement felt careful, restrained, as if a wrong sound might break something that was already fragile. Nhi sat close to the fire, hugging her knees. She wasn't playing. She wasn't talking. She simply watched the flames, occasionally glancing at James, then back at her mother. Even without understanding the details, she felt the change. Diep finally broke the silence. "So, you're really going back," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement. James lifted his eyes. "Yes, tomorrow morning." Her fingers tightened around the ladle. "That fast?" "My father doesn't like uncertainty," James replied. "If I delay, he'll only make things harder." Diep turned off the stove and sat down across from him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were tired. Tired in a way that came from holding too much emotion inside. "And after you go back?" she asked. "What does your father want?" "He wants me home," James said. "Under his roof, under his rules." She nodded slowly. "And what do you want?" James hesitated. "I want to protect you and Nhi," he said honestly. "Right now, staying here only gives him excuses to attack this life. If I leave temporarily, it takes that weapon away." Diep lowered her gaze. "So this is a sacrifice?" "Yes," he said, "but not a surrender." Nhi suddenly spoke up, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Uncle James, are you mad at me?" James froze. "Why would you think that?" She fidgeted with her fingers. "If I wasn't here, your parents wouldn't be angry." His chest tightened painfully. He moved toward her immediately, kneeling down and pulling her into his arms. "Listen to me," he said gently. "None of this is because of you. Ever." She looked up at him, eyes shiny. "Then why do you have to go?" James swallowed hard. "Because sometimes adults have to fix problems that were created a long time ago." She thought about that for a moment, then nodded seriously, as if accepting a truth far bigger than her age. "Then you have to come back," she said firmly. James smiled, though his eyes burned. "I will." That night, after Nhi had fallen asleep, curled up beside her mother, Diep and James sat together by the fire. The flames were low now, barely holding on, casting long shadows across the walls. "My father hates that I chose this life," James said quietly. "He thinks I embarrassed him." Diep leaned her head slightly against the wall. "He hates losing control." "Yes," James agreed. "And he hates that I'm no longer afraid." She turned to look at him. "But you are afraid." James nodded. "I am. Not of him. Of losing you." Her lips trembled, but she managed a small smile. "Then don't lose us." He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I won't. Even if I'm not here physically, I'm not leaving you." Diep looked down at their intertwined fingers. "I've lived my whole life learning how to be strong alone," she said softly. "But this time, I really don't want to." James leaned closer. "Then don't be. Let me carry part of it." Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. They stayed like that for a long time, memorizing each other's warmth, the sound of breathing, the quiet intimacy of simply being together. Morning arrived too soon. The sky was pale and colorless, the air biting cold. James packed quietly, folding each item slowly, deliberately, as if time might stretch if he moved carefully enough. Diep prepared breakfast. She didn't say much. Neither did he. Nhi woke up early and followed James around the house, her small footsteps trailing behind him. She handed him things she thought he might need: his scarf, a pen, even a piece of paper with her scribbles on it. "This is so you don't forget how our house looks," she explained seriously. James laughed softly and hugged her tightly. "I'll never forget." When the car arrived, the sound of the engine felt cruelly loud. James stood at the door, hesitating. Diep stood in front of him, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her hands betrayed her, clenched tightly at her sides. "I'll call every day," James said. She nodded. "I know. And I'll come back as soon as I can." "I know," she repeated, then added quietly, "Just don't let them turn you into someone I don't recognize." He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. "I won't." As the car pulled away, Diep didn't chase it. She simply stood there, watching until it disappeared, then slowly closed the door behind her. Back at his parents' home, everything felt heavy. The house was spotless, perfectly arranged, and emotionally cold. His mother hovered constantly, asking questions, offering food, checking on him as if afraid he might vanish again. His father remained distant, watching, evaluating. That night, James lay awake in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling he once knew so well. The walls felt closer than ever. The next days were filled with meetings, documents, and obligations. James returned to the company, slipping back into a role that once defined him. Employees greeted him respectfully. Some whispered, some smiled cautiously. His father seemed satisfied, at least on the surface. But James had changed. Every night, he called Diep. Sometimes they talked about small things. Nhi's day, the orchard, the weather. Sometimes they talked about nothing at all, simply staying connected through silence. One evening, Diep's voice sounded especially tired. "You're working too hard," she said. "So are you," James replied. She smiled faintly. "At least I can see the stars at night." James looked out the window at the city skyline. "I miss that." Days passed. His parents began pushing again. Subtle hints about marriage, expectations, reputation. His father spoke often about duty. His mother spoke about sacrifice. James listened politely, but he no longer felt trapped. One night, after another tense dinner, James stood alone on the balcony. The city lights stretched endlessly, bright but distant. His phone vibrated. A message from Diep. "Nhi fell asleep holding your scarf." James closed his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. In that moment, his fear solidified into determination. He would not let distance erase what they had built. He would face his parents, not with anger, but with resolve. This separation wasn't breaking him. It was sharpening him.